Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to the AI and Human Rights Forum organized by the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. Thank you for joining us today. This is our annual conference on artificial intelligence and human rights. And today I'm delighted to welcome or host Julia Haas from the OSCE. She will introduce the first panel and lead the first panel on AI in content governance and content control, policy responses to safeguard free speech. Julia, thank you for joining us today, and thank you also to the OSCE for being such a great partner. Julia, the floor is yours to introduce the speaker and lead the first discussion today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marie, and thanks to the Mix for the kind introduction and invitation. Good afternoon from Vienna, and welcome to our session on AI and content governance and content control. In the hour that we have together here today, we want to focus on policy responses to safeguards to freedom of expression. So we all know that the way that social media and online platforms govern content, and with govern, I mean both moderate but also curate, shapes our communication and arbitrates our public discourse. And platforms use AI, artificial intelligence, to decide which content is removed, but also what content is prioritized and to whom which piece of content is disseminated at what point in time. So this is kind of the baseline of today's discussions, that content governance and the use of AI for it impacts and influences what we see, both individually, but also as a society, because it impacts the flow of information and therefore also the right to seek, receive, and impart information. And information, of course, is the baseline for all of our decision and kind of everything around us. So, and again, here it's true for both the individual level, but also in a larger sense, if we speak about peace or security, comprehensive security and stability. And that's true at all times, but also, of course, or even more so at times of crisis, be it COVID, climate, or conflict. We at the OSCE Representative on Freedom of the Media have put a spotlight on the impact of artificial intelligence and freedom of expression, SAFE. And together with my colleague Denise Wagner and more than 120 experts from various different backgrounds and more than 2 years of work, we have developed a policy manual that provides guidance and recommendations to states with the aim to ensure that content governance, both the policies around it, but also their enforcement, are in line with international human rights standards. So today we will discuss who can and should be doing what for a better and more human rights-centric online information. And I'm very excited to have 4 excellent speakers with me here today, and I will very briefly introduce them in alphabetical order. First of all, we have Asha Allen from the Center for Democracy and Technology, where she's the Advocacy Director for Europe Online Expression and Civic Space. We also have Courtney Raj, who is Fellow at the UCLA Institute for Technology, Law and Policy and Senior Fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Moreover, we have Eliška Pekova, who is Access Now's Europe Policy Analyst and Global Freedom of Expression Lead. And she has been our most important and excellent partner in our SAFE project in the last 2 years. Last but not least, we have Matthias Kettemann, who is, among many different affiliations, Professor of Innovation Theory and Philosophy of Law at the University of Innsbruck. So we have just in the conversation we had before the start of this meeting discussed that this is really an interesting point in time that we have in the conversation we are having today, because on Friday, or actually Saturday morning during the night, the EU co-legislators agreed on the Digital Services Act, the DSA, which is, even though it's not the final approved version, has been politically agreed and now has really been a milestone when we speak about platform governance. So maybe let me start with Eliška, because I know that she has been following this process very closely, while of course others have as well, and also because she has been our main partner in the SAFE project. We have been speaking as society, I think, a lot about content moderation in the narrow sense of removing, detect, or like using AI to detect and remove specific content. But AI is also used for disseminating information and content. So this is kind of like the other side of the same coin, the curation of content. So can you maybe briefly tell us why is it so important to also look at the algorithmic recommender systems that are to a certain degree also addressed in the DSA, but also beyond that at the business models and surveillance-based advertising that the platforms do?
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me today. It's a great pleasure to take part in this great event. And indeed, Access Now had a great opportunity to become implementing partner to this timely and fascinating project. The policy manual intentionally distinguishes between the practices of content moderation and content curation, also due to practical methodological reasons, but both issues are equally important. So if I could maybe slightly reformulate your question, I would perhaps start with, is there anyone out there still who would think that content moderation and issues related to content moderation would be enough in order to create that human rights centric model of platform governance that we all are striving for many years now? And the answer is obviously no. And I think precisely the Digital Services Act, even though we only reached the first political agreement and we still have to wait what is exactly in the law, and that will be uncovered step by step in the following weeks. But indeed, it's a sort of new generation of the law that precisely looks into systems and processes deployed by platforms that equally include content moderation and standard freedom of expression issues connected to intermediary reliability and the use of automated tools, as much as it looks into the issues of content creation, so content recommender systems, transparency, but also, and that's perhaps one of the most victorious part of the DSA, although far from the only one, it now contains, and that can be somehow confirmed, the ban on the use of sensitive data or special categories of data of users in targeting and amplifying, which are usually also one of the main reasons or driving forces behind the spread of illegal content, but also behind the spread of potentially harmful content such as disinformation. So it's, if anything, DSA definitely symbolizes the paradigm shift that was so much desired, because previously we saw a number of legislative initiatives that focus purely on the content moderation issues, on swift removals of user-generated content under very short deadlines. And with the DSA, hopefully, we might be starting a new era where data harvesting business models of platforms with a significant influence on public sphere is definitely a main driving force behind a number of human rights violations in online space. Especially in our policy manual, we also use absolute freedoms to form an opinion and absolute freedom of thought as an underlining issue. What can actually happen when these manipulative and deceptive practices are unchecked and often happening with no public scrutiny or effective oversight or accountability for platforms. And there were a number of occasions when the society was directly confronted with the consequences of such practices. Cambridge Analytica was mentioned many times, but recently also examples of what happened during French elections and how users were targeted with political messages using their most sensitive behavioral data. I don't want to debate on how far the DSA goes in that regard, and that remains to be seen. But content curation is as equally important as content moderation. And all of those directly shape the way how freedom of expression of online users, freedom of opinion, but also adequate access to information is actually being shaped. And if anything, and that will be my final point, in recent months, we became even more confronted with the reality when, due to the war in Ukraine, when especially very large online platforms are often the last resort of adequate access to information for those who are trapped in terrible circumstances of war, but also in those countries that experience other forms of crisis. And this adequate access to information can be seriously distorted as a result of different practices that are directly stemming from data harvesting business models and that can actually manipulate users. And this is on one hand, something that is being done by platform as much as often abused by state actors themselves as well, in order to spread state-sponsored propaganda or war propaganda, which is something we have witnessed on regular basis since the war in Ukraine started. So I think that there is no question anymore why the content curation is so essential. I think that hopefully with the DSA and other laws to follow, there is now a full understanding with policymakers and legislators that there is truly absolute need and necessity to tackle this issue equally.
Thanks a lot for this introduction into the DSA, but also for really underlining that finally, maybe because for many years, advocates like Access Now and many others, but also international organizations like the OSCE have really been called for having this kind of more systematic approach, and also looking at the processes of the dissemination of information way more than the content and the content message itself, which can be then again abused, like the last point that you mentioned. I want to quickly pick up one issue that you raised now and maybe move to Matthias, because you have been our rapporteur in the discussions we had around security threats and the use of AI to detect it. Of course, if we speak about the invasion and war against Ukraine, we see also that there is a lot of, or maybe the discussion becomes even more prevalent about terrorist, violent, extremist content online. And we know that this is also traditionally the most maybe, or like the least controversial use of AI. Can you maybe briefly tell us if this is an area where you consider AI to be really helpful and really helpful to improve the environment, the informational environment and freedom of opinion and the free flow of information, or whether there are also specific challenges that the use of AI to detect such content brings with it?
Thank you so much, Julia, for having me. Hi, everybody. The problem with AI is that it is a blunt tool. It is a hammer, right? And with a hammer, you can destroy a lot of bad content effectively. But the problem is, very often, as blunt instruments go, this leads to an insensitive approach to content, and that is sort of one of the issues that the recent OSCE paper looked at, and I'm happy to share some ideas we've developed regarding the use of AI in fighting security threats, fighting hate speech, but especially security threats. So first of all, you all know that one person's security threat is perhaps another person's cry for freedom. So we should take care not to gloss over the differences in how security threats are defined. Just calling for AI to be used in filtering for terrorist or extremist content does not absolve us from the question to define exactly what kind of content we are talking about. So we need to be sure what security threats we're talking about. Are there actually security threats? Are there actually imminent threats that need to be acted upon? And if it is imminent threats that have to be acted upon, does it make sense to use AI to filter and delete them, or should we rather make sure that they get high priority in being acted upon, actually? And that doesn't mean filtering, but rather put forward to those in authority to do something about the threat. So all states agree it's an issue of international law, international legal commitment, that fighting terrorism has to be. There's a commitment to fight terrorism-related imagery, to fight financing of terrorism. So these are international legal commitments, and states have an obligation to ensure that they act upon those international legal commitments by, again, forcing the national platforms they have control over to also fight against that kind of content, including by, if that makes sense, using AI. And very often the use of AI makes sense in that context, because we all know the advantages of AI-based content governance. It works fast, and it usually works rather effective. However, this only is true if we exactly know what we're talking about. And as I've mentioned at the beginning, defining what a security threat is, defining what terrorism is, is a challenge. However, we can happily draw from decades of jurisprudence from courts all across the world, including the European Court of Human Rights, including the the court within the Organization of American States. Those courts have have developed a jurisprudence on what exactly terrorism or promotion of terrorism means and what its limits are, and we should use those approaches have been used by different states and by certain companies to refine what kind of content they are acting upon, including through the use of AI. One issue that the report has raised, which is kind of another challenge, is that these policies, when implemented, need to be made transparent. So companies have to make sure that we know what content they're acting upon, especially using AI. And the argument that they're doing that for, to save people from terrorism isn't good enough. They still need to be transparent about what kind of content they are acting upon and the kind of actions they're taking. Are they taking that down? Are they demoting it? Are they demonetizing it? Are they shadow banning it? So we need to know much more about what actions are taken with regard to content, and we also need to be more sensitive to the different categories of content. In the study, we've differentiated between clearly illegal content, so content that's illegal irrespective of the context, including specific content supporting terrorist ideologies, and content that is not quite so clearly illegal. And as the grade of illegality decreases, the more challenging it will be for companies to act upon that content, the more challenging will it be to use AI-based content filtering. So my call here would be to say that in order to use AI effectively to fight against online security threats, we first need to make sure we know what we're talking about. We need to make sure that in implementing any AI-based content moderation, we provide the necessary safeguards. We ensure transparency of the rules and of the actions taken. We ensure, if possible, a legal recourse to any measures taken by platforms. But all of that should be considered part and parcel of the overall commitment and obligation by states to ensure to all of their citizens, the full enjoyment of their human rights, and that includes also the right to life and liberty and security. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. I think much what you have been saying now is basically calling for checks and balances that are parallel to the general rule of law requirements we're having for basically everything we're dealing with. I also want to pick up on something you said, which I think is incredibly important, that very often also in societal debates, we think we can just kind of like outsource a problem to technology to solve it, which of course is not possible if we don't find like the solution that we want as a society to have in the first place. And if we speak about terrorist or extremist security threat content, this might be even easier to define than when we speak about hate speech or disinformation or other things that are even more complicated to define also from a legal perspective and from a human rights perspective. So maybe to follow up on this whole discussion about regulatory responses, and you also mentioned that very often laws require the removal of specific content by the platforms. Maybe if I would now ask Asha to take the floor to give us a little bit of an insight, if we have this legal mandates or like this legally mandate governance of specific content. And especially if we then have like a short time frame, which kind of necessitates the use of AI, this might all lead to a kind of like slippery slope if we don't first have the definitions, if we are not able to entrench all this kind of like human rights jurisprudence, for example, that Matthias has been mentioning into the AI. What do you think is the biggest challenge here? Or is it a trade-off that is worth it if we speak about problematic content? Or is it something that you think should never be legally mandated per se?
Thank you so much for the invitation to speak today and for the greatly positive questions, and to the previous two speakers for really setting the foundation for this wonderful discussion. And you are absolutely right. For CDT Europe, which for those of you who don't know us, CDT is a not-for-profit organization that advocates for fundamental and human rights in tech policy, and our European office focuses on towards European policymakers. And this question around the kind of mandating of automated content moderation, particularly in the context that we find ourselves in with the Digital Services Act, but other regulatory proposals moving quite quickly, it's really important that we take into consideration what's already been outlined by some of the speakers here today, and some of the analysis that CDT has done, because of course it would be a grave misstep to mandate the use of such technologies. And I think in the case of content moderation, we're thinking of AI in the context of automated content analysis tools, of which I will be able to provide some examples momentarily. But briefly to say, it would be a misstep to mandate the use of these technologies within legislation, because such technologies as they stand at the moment would pose a high risk to human rights in our online spaces. And legislations may not have to directly mandate this explicitly in the text in order for this to be an issue. Like you already mentioned, it may be inadvertently put forward as a provision if there is a mandating of short timeframes for content removal, which will ultimately result in platforms adopting an increased use of automated content moderation. So understanding these tools and their capabilities and limitations when used in connection to, say, multimedia or the online space is crucial for stakeholders in order to make more informed choices. But to give a little bit of context of what we're talking about here, especially in the context of content moderation, we're talking about tools such as matching models, for example, which are generally well suited for analyzing, say, existing images and audio and video, particularly where there are some content that tends to be circulated repeatedly. Or another example would be around kind of predictive models that can be well suited to analyzing content for which ample and comprehensive training data is available, and can perform very well in identifying objective features, or such as whether, multimedia contains clear nudity, for example. So there are some benefits. But as your question indicates, there are significant limitations to these tools, and CDT and my wonderful colleagues have conducted some important research identifying these limitations that do present a risk to human rights. And the specific of these limitations is around robustness to start off with. So state-of-the-art automated analysis tools that perform well in, say, controlled settings struggle quite a lot to analyze new or previously unseen types of multimedia. And robustness can be circumvented, unfortunately, and efforts to circumvent them, is a reoccurring problem when it comes to multimedia analysis tools. And efforts to circumvent these tools don't actually require inside access to the development of these tools or knowledge of how the model is developed in order to be successful in those efforts. So one example that we think of that comes to mind is the use of deepfakes, for example, which present advanced challenges for automated systems. Now, another limitation I would highlight is on data quality. It's been touched on by previous speakers, but decisions based on automated content analysis kind of risk amplifying biases in the real world. One example that I would draw from in the research that we did were tests conducted by the ACLU in the United States on Amazon's facial recognition technology, which mistakenly matched 28 members of Congress with a mugshot database and identified them as having been arrested for crimes. And as you can imagine, many of those were people of color. Now, very quickly to go through some other limitations, it's also about a lack of context or contextual understanding. For many of these automated tools, they perform poorly when tasked with decisions requiring the appreciation of context. And these tools also perform poorly when tasked with decisions requiring judgment or appreciation of, say, cultural, linguistic, social, historical, or other contextual analyses, and that humans would be readily easy to be able to recognize. And the last two that I would highlight is around measurability. General claims of accuracy typically do not represent the actual multitude of metrics for model performance. And lastly, I would say explainability. It's very difficult to understand the steps that automated tools take in terms of the conclusions that they reach. And although there's a no one-size-fits-all approach to explainability, this presents still a problem. So taking this all into consideration, these are the limitations that we are faced with the technologies that we have right now. And we have defining legislation being defined right now. So it would be, once again, a huge mistake to mandate the use of such tools or to outline provisions that would lead to the increased use of these tools within regulatory frameworks related to platform or content governance. There is a lot more research and analysis that needs to be conducted, and there's a lot more work that still needs to be done to improve these tools to make sure they are not perpetuating biases or harms to individual users or collective groups.
Thanks so much for outlining the limitations. I think it's always very, very useful to be reminded about the different layers of challenges we are facing, and that they're really breaking down to the individual person and their access to information and also their ability to speak out. So what I'm kind of taking from what you were saying is that we do need kind of regulatory responses, but that it's not sufficient to just have well-intended regulation, which makes it even more important to have kind of a multi-stakeholder approach in this development of regulation. And another point that you mentioned that I maybe want to follow up to now with Courtney is that you spoke about one limitation being the lack of understanding of context, which of course is highly relevant in all the content form that we've been discussing so far, but is maybe even more challenging when we speak about disinformation, because there it is very, very difficult to often, or to in general, draw a line between kind of like truth and falsity. And then we also have the question about intent to mislead or harm. So it's a very complex issue, even for human beings. So I, of course, if you would outsource this kind of like detecting to AI, it is even more difficult. So Courtney, could you maybe speak a little bit about disinformation from the perspective of content moderation, but maybe also make this link to what we have been discussing in the beginning about content curation, algorithmic recommendation systems, and the question of which information and why disinformation is so widely, effectively, and often shared and spread on these online platforms.
Sure. Thank you so much. I appreciate being part of the SAFE consultations over the past year. I think it's a really important investigation into the role that AI does play in content moderation and respecting human rights. Although I might take a little bit of a different approach than Matthias in terms of not seeing AI necessarily as a hammer, and that while transparency is definitely important, it is insufficient. And that one of the things lawmakers should really be thinking about is safeguards more broadly on the system. So let me talk a little bit about what that system looks like. I mean, the past few years have seen exponential increases in the capabilities of artificial intelligence and machine learning, alongside the use of increasingly sophisticated information operations to manipulate the public sphere. We talked earlier about Ukraine and Russia's war in Ukraine, its illegal invasion, but of course that was preceded by years of weaponized propaganda campaigns. And in fact, what we see around the world is that weaponized and gendered disinformation influence campaigns and online harassment have compounded existing human rights challenges and created new ones because they leverage these very complicated, often unexplainable to kind of the average layperson design of primarily application layer platforms. So, content and social media platforms and the AI systems that power them. And they pursue a strategy of undermining, drowning out, and delegitimizing real news through coordinated efforts to silence critics and manipulate public opinion. And we're also seeing the pushing of content moderation down the tech stack into the infrastructure layer, which means that I think we're going to see AI being used by a even wider range of companies and sectors to engage in what amounts to content moderation or intervention. So, I think Asha gave a really good overview of some of the key type of systems at play here. But I would raise the fact that algorithms and machine learning at the root are responsible in content moderation for identifying, making visible content, amplifying content or accounts, predicting engagement with content, and for targeted advertising and promotion. So let's remember, this is all ultimately a monetary system. The automation through algorithmic instructions and progressive machine learning influences content and account removals. It can lead to shadow banning, prioritization or deprioritization, promotion or demotion, curation, monetization of content, all of which it impacts all content, but particularly news content, because essentially journalism news content is typically seen as an antidote to disinformation. The challenge is that AI systems need to be able to identify what is news, or reliable news, trustworthy news, news sites that typically are known for their integrity. And this is important because as we see AI being called upon to be deployed prior to publication, and thus in advance of moderation through upload filters and hash databases, we're going to be needing to be very careful about the impact on news organizations that might have. We heard earlier about some of the security and terrorism aspects where we've seen a convergence, for the most part, around wanting to combat terrorism and violent extremism online. But we also know that news content is often likely to be caught up in that because, as we know, context is really difficult to determine by AI. And that includes context, whether we're talking about terrorism, reporting on terrorism or promoting terrorism, but also, satire, jokes, fair use. All of these are really difficult for an AI system to identify as legitimate. So we're also seeing that, the algorithmic impacts of these systems are impacted both by bots, so other automated systems, as well as human attraction to negative and novel information. That's just something we know from social psychology. This affects how people engage and behave, while bots increase the potential for exposure and can manipulate predictive content engagement algorithms. So what this ends up doing is it skews the prevalence of disinformation, it drowns out other information, and really importantly, it fills information voids. So when there isn't a lot of information on something, disinformation and especially the algorithms that are then involved in content circulation get involved in that. So we saw this, for example, in Raqqa, where Raqqa is being slaughtered silently actually started up as a response to ISIS taking over and declaring Raqqa as its caliphate. And there was nothing in English in Raqqa on Raqqa. And so they had this, kind of hole that ISIS filled, and RBSS wanted to kind of make sure that ISIS was not the only one providing information. We saw the same thing with COVID at the outset, with a lot of disinformation relating to COVID, vaccines, whenever anything is new and there's a void. And we have to remember that AI is shaped by a corporate logic. It's not by a logic of public interest. And I think that's where regulators can focus. The corporate logic is based on platforms and profit, whoever can pay, and growth maximization. This influences where resources are devoted. the countries, languages, issues that receive resources from tech platforms. It impacts research priorities, the private versus public interest, where they put resources towards harm identification, prioritization, and reduction. And this algorithmic intermediation is designed based on this logic, which is also one of personalization. So oftentimes you only see what you look for or discover, and you're influenced by design decisions such as lookalike audiences, which allow advertisers and others to target you based on lookalike audiences. This has important impacts on agenda setting, framing, and, as I mentioned, information voids. So when you have gatekeeping, which previously was often done by journalists and others, scientists, now we have a kind of intermediation of gatekeeping by oftentimes social media and internet companies. And so this has shifted who the gatekeepers are and what the logic of gatekeeping is. Journalism norms were typically structured around the public interest. Platform norms are structured around ad tech. And therefore we see that this has an impact in how algorithms and content reward mechanisms make it easy to promote, amplify, and monetize low quality information, including disinformation and harassment. And I think that when we look at the concepts of agenda setting, framing, and certification, we see how algorithms play an overarching role in telling the public where to focus its attention, helping create, which institutions, which accounts are seen as trustworthy and therefore available for amplification or monetization. We see large numbers of accounts with followers post content, and yet oftentimes high-profile political accounts are given preferential treatment and protection from the negative impacts of content moderation, which can end up having a really detrimental impact on the broader ecosystem. I think with the example of Russia, RT, and Sputnik, chief among those. So let me conclude there because I know we want to get into more of a discussion. And thank you, Julia.
Thanks so much. I mean, there was a lot to unpack, but I think it's really important to always kind of like have as a baseline this understanding that this corporate logic that you have been pointing out, because sometimes this kind of like business models and business practices can really be at odds with accuracy, with pluralism, and basically with human rights. So let us maybe turn it around now and say, we do know that states have a positive obligation to protect pluralism and to protect freedom of the media and independent news reporting and journalism, but also the free flow of information and freedom of opinion, freedom of expression. So turning to the question of what states, or kind of like what could be the main recommendations for states to really say, how can they ensure that the online information system is in line with our human rights and not at odds with them. So Eliška, maybe you can start to point out briefly, like if you think there are some kind of like human rights centric recommendations that are so evident that you can really easily point to them that would already make this first shift to really improve the situation.
Thank you, Julia. Indeed, as a global human rights organization, we see a number of state efforts to regulate and control online spaces, often opting for very short-sighted solutions. And maybe just to give you a number of trends that we actually observe to underline the importance of your questions and essentially also the importance of those recommendations, more and more we see disproportionate laws that criminalize speech, including different categories of user-generated content, such as disinformation, which is, however, considered, for instance, within the EU scope as a legal content, as well as defamation. We also see intentional censoring of freedom of expression online via direct or indirect pressure, which is then, of course, put on these platforms by state actors. And especially in last year, we saw lots of these informal cooperation, which is very much, or informal pressure, which is very much then connected to the deployment of automated tools that we discussed today. For instance, very often we see states through different tools, such as, for instance, internet referral units. And one such a unit that actually practices these on a regular basis is, for instance, in Israel, that delivers to platforms or reports the content that somehow violates either their own terms of service, which is of course backsliding on the self-regulation of these platforms, and recommends to platforms to remove such piece of content, by which the state can then exercise the control over online space and of course suppress the dissent or critique of the government. And we gradually see outlawing private actors or labeling them extremist organizations. And the recent case of Meta being labeled as extremist organization in Russia by the decision of the court in Moscow is a good example of that, and also of the fact that states are gradually being really aware of the power the business model and access to data can give them. And for instance, to just demonstrate this on this example of Meta in Russia, it's also the commercial activity of Meta that can be now considered illegal. So if someone will try to buy ads on a Facebook platform, for instance, that could be actually considered a criminal activity. So these shortcomings of these business models can be also equally abused by states, and we often see that in practice that that's the case. So the number one recommendation, of course, for the states is to comply with the rule of law, with the principles of the rule of law, and to respect their own constitutions and human rights order. That's very much the starting point. And especially when we discuss the freedom of expression, how freedom of expression is being regulated, whether online or offline, is always directly connected to the state of the rule of law and democratic order in that particular country. But the state can also regulate platforms, and we see that again on the example of the EU and the DSA, how such a regulation can actually look like, and especially with the emphasis on algorithmic or automated decision-making processes. So instead of looking for short-sighted solutions, and we said this number of times, and it's a sort of a mantra among civil societies, it's important to focus on those processes and also on due diligence safeguards. And I think that's also the most novel element within the DSA, but we already slowly see how other Western democracies and countries are getting inspired by the idea of due diligence. And due diligence is not only about transparency, even though transparency is essential precondition, transparency that is actually legally mandated. So it's not only some generosity showed by platforms when they are under too much pressure and they try to escape any public or regulatory scrutiny, but it's actually a legal obligation for them to be meaningfully transparent and to provide qualitative data about their algorithmic systems, whether these are content recommender systems or systems used for other purposes, including distribution of ads. And furthermore, these due diligence safeguards also cover issues such as risk assessment. And this we would like to see to be applied really due diligently. So the risk assessment, what kind of risks are being imposed by algorithmic decision-making processes that platform deploy. And Asha very well pointed out to discriminatory bias that these algorithmic content curation and content moderation tools often carry within. So there has to be specific emphasis on vulnerable groups that then ultimately, if these systems are being trained on the wrong set of data, they commit discriminatory, they basically spread discrimination. And also, and that is very much connected to the question from the audience, and I will just quickly touch upon that, the independent audits that are being oversight by regulatory independent authorities are also equally important in that process. So once the company actually assess the systems, is this assessment correct? What kind of criteria it took into consideration? And is it capable of responding to those real risks that it imposes on the society? So I cannot help just going back to the DSA, since we just reached a big landmark in that sense, but I believe that DSA will also be influential at the international level, and we can definitely expect some regulatory spillover. And if states are looking for one example of good practice, then definitely emphasis on these due diligence safeguards is the key to achieve a sustainable platform governance model that doesn't rely anymore on just quick removal of content, because we know that that's hardly sustainable and does not really deliver any adequate response to these societal issues.
Thanks so much also for touching already upon one of the questions. I mean, I myself would have been able to continue for hours with additional questions, but let's indeed move to those from the audience. And thanks for picking the one up on independent auditing. I think it is also really relevant that you underlined that transparency is essential, but it's a means and it's not the aim per se. And that self-regulation, and I think this is really what this question about the independent auditing was also about, to say, yes, we need due diligence, we need risk assessments, but the self-regulation part and the approach, the merely self-regulatory approach has really proven to be insufficient when we speak about the protection of our human rights, when it is done by these commercial actors, which are gatekeepers and have this power concentrated and really very corporate thinking that also Courtney has been mentioning before. So let me touch upon one of the other questions, which is concerning children. And maybe I can touch or I can ask Asha also to take this question, because you have been speaking before to this discrimination or like discriminatory impact that the use of AI can have, and biases that was also now mentioned again by Eliška. So how can we ensure that the regulatory responses have or include a perspective that is sensitive to groups in society that have maybe faced discrimination or marginalization, if we speak about gender, but also an intersectional lens, but also this topic of children that has been pointed out by one in our audience, that we need to have a specific kind of like aspect to be aware of particular vulnerabilities that children may have, but without restricting the freedom of expression and the right to access to information by children themselves.
No, thank you so much. I'd absolutely like to pick up on this point, because the question itself refers, directly to the use of AI that's related to children that we must be aware of. But it does bring us to this analysis for the need for an intersectional methodology when talking about not only AI, but the regulatory processes and the regulatory responses that are developed. Because, of course, like many other groups that experience marginalization or heightened forms of discrimination, children, women, LGBTI communities are not a homogenous group. There is a diversity of issues that they may be facing and forms of discrimination that they may be facing. And often these can be intersecting depending on the different identities that they themselves live with. So the important question about the preservation of our fundamental rights online is really founded upon this. So, fully understanding how abuses and harms can manifest really does require a comprehensive and nuanced understanding. And at the very crux of this is the adoption of an intersectional methodology. Now, Eliška fantastically pointed to the significance of due diligence obligations within existing frameworks, and legislators and industry alike need to better adopt this intersectional approach, especially as we find ourselves in the midst of a lot of legislation related to content governance. But legislators, as a first point of call, could really look to ensure the harmonization of relevant legislative frameworks in this regard. So I will pick up on the point that you mentioned about gender there. In the EU, we have the draft directive on combating gender-based violence, which directly references the Digital Services Act as the kind of referent horizontal framework for the legal basis that it establishes in criminalizing certain forms of gender-based online violence. But at the same time, the Digital Services Act, from what we know so far, also includes cyber violence from a gender perspective as one of the systemic risks that very large online platforms should assess and mitigate. So how will these due diligence obligations align? And how will the two legislations align? But how will they adopt, of course, an intersectional approach in order to be able to fully grasp the complexity of the manifestation of online gender-based violence? And will they, working concurrently, have a concrete impact for victims? And again, this brings us back to the human rights impact assessments and their significance in concretely addressing these issues, because within those impact assessments, an intersectional methodology, which is a very concrete approach, can definitely be adopted. But for platforms too, they will need to ensure that their mitigation measures and what they adopt are founded upon assessments that adopt a similar methodology. And the requirement possibly in the DSA. Okay, hopefully we're hoping this remains, but the requirement to consult civil society organizations and experts within the DSA will mean not only consulting technical experts or AI experts, but digital rights, women's rights, LGBTQI and racial justice organizations, to name but a few, in order to make sure that these assessments and those measures that are developed to mitigate potential risks are as comprehensive and as nuanced as possible. So, and the process needs to be consistent, I would say, as a last point in its evolution. And this means supporting the development of vital research, which in itself can also adopt an intersectional research methodology in order to better identify the risks and harms caused by AI tools in perpetuating discrimination and bias. So there needs to be a holistic analysis and a comprehensive approach when moving forward, when thinking about specific risks that may impact on specific groups, but also how the risks they're experiencing intersect with other groups, and what are the best approaches to tackle issues in the best possible way.
Thanks. So the keywords certainly are multi-stakeholder, intersectional lens, and also this consistency. Maybe also because you just raised this point on specific risks that face specific groups, but also specific risks that may be existing due to a specific kind of like crisis situation. And again, linking it back to the DSA, as we have seen the political agreement on Friday, there is a specific aspect now that has been introduced only now at the very end of the negotiations, which refers to crisis situations, where there is the aim that the Commission in this sense, but also, of course, this discussion exists also in other regulatory responses, that a state or the European Commission or any other actor might have more control, or should be able to have more control over the content governance on platforms in times of crisis. So maybe, Matthias, can you quickly point out, like it underlines, I think personally, really the power over information that also the European Union ascribes to platforms, and also for the developing of individual opinions. Is this kind of reflected in the regulatory responses? Should it be? Or is this also something that might again lead back to what we have been discussing at the very beginning, the potential for misuse of regulatory responses that might by themselves be very problematic and lead to censorship or discrimination in any other way?
Thank you. That, of course, is an extremely important question, also in light of current events. We can't act as if the of Russia's war on Ukraine hasn't impacted the way that we approach dealing with information and communication flows. I firmly believe that there is a new field opening up, which we can tentatively call conflict information law or information conflict law. We see that major conflicts are being waged online, and that the power to decide what can be said about conflicts, on conflicts, regarding conflicts, is a power that needs to be controlled. States should not overreact. So there are quite a number of international lawyers and European law experts who are rather critical of the European Union's approach towards regulating certain online and offline media outlets from Russia. But the basic idea here is very sound, namely that platforms that have control over extremely important information and communication flows need to be better controlled in conflict situations. Currently, this right of the Commission to require platforms to support efforts to fight crisis through provisioning data, through ensuring data access, has the potential to be misused because of the rather vague boundaries which I see in the current form. While I don't doubt that data access in crisis situations is important, we've seen that during the Corona crisis. We're seeing that during the war in Ukraine. I believe that we need to be extremely careful in allowing these basically legalized states of exception. I rather think that we should approach this the way of transparency and accountability. So just as we are increasing in different legislative approaches, increasing the accountability and transparency related duties of platforms. It makes a lot of sense for them, for us to know more about their crisis protocols beforehand, to know similarly to the information rights we have regarding their own risk assessments for how their rules impact democracy, how the rules impact public health. We need to make sure that we also know enough about how those rules work in conflict. And I think that looking back at the last couple of months, we will have ample opportunity to study the realities of information conflict governance and see where the pitfalls are. And I believe that in implementing the DSA, at least in the implementation phase, at least, we'll be able to harness some of that knowledge to make sure that the normative field is better plowed. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yes, I mean, of course, we are only in kind of like the beginning of, unfortunately, this crisis, which was certainly, again, like changed the way we call for, also society calls for content governance online. And there, maybe just to add one point, that when we speak about disinformation propaganda, there, of course, also from the human rights perspective, it is crucial to make this differentiation between disinformation or propaganda for war, where actually from a human rights perspective, there's even a need to prohibit or remove in the online content such kind of information. Maybe in closing, Courtney, you have been speaking before also about the use of AI or like the weaponization, instrumentalization of AI to silence journalists, critical voices, human rights defenders. We also had a question to this in the chat that you already responded to, whether this is something, a phenomena only known in one region, or unfortunately, as you responded, this is something that happens around the globe. But maybe do you want to add one last point on like, how can we address in the regulatory responses that there is a specific kind of like a malicious aim or like a malicious element where states or other powerful actors can really misuse the logic of the AI and the corporate systems to silence specific actors. You have already spoken a lot about it, but maybe you can also link this to kind of like a closing call. If you would say now at the end of this session, you would have one main recommendation or one call of action that is also related to this conversation, what you have been explaining before, what would it be?
Yeah, so thank you for that, Julian. Just to respond to the question was whether there are disinformation and issues around the world, or whether they're regional specific. And in fact, we see around the world, according to the Oxford Internet Institute, they've tracked cyber troops being used in at least 70 countries. They leverage social media platforms, messaging apps, and state-aligned media to create this industry that has emerged. And we know that the platforms, Facebook took down 150 information operations between 2017 and 2020. We know that Twitter has taken down many. We've seen that these social media apps are increasingly reporting on those takedowns. So I think that if we think about the recommendations for what policy makers actually need to do to address this, I think we want to be careful about saying out of hand that AI is incompatible with human rights. AI, as it is currently being deployed without sufficient transparency, accountability, oversight, explainability, is certainly giving rise to human rights abuses. And so I think that what we need to do for policymakers is to think about how you make sure that there is oversight into the data inputs, into the language models, the vision models that are being used to create and develop these algorithms, whose data is included and how that is collected, who has ownership and availability and access to that data. We then need to look at how that data is used in order to create recommendation systems, search systems, all of the different, getting into the specifics, which the policy manual does really well, the specifics of different types of algorithmic interventions that content moderation platforms or content platforms can deploy, and making sure that there's insight into that. I think that the calls for transparency are very necessary but insufficient. People cannot have sufficient autonomy and input into how information is fed to them through these systems simply with transparency. There needs to be, I think, built-in accountability. The fact that we know, that Russia spent $400,000 a month, was the average budget for the Russia Internet Agency, according to reporting by the New York Times, and a lot of that was spent on social media advertising. Those are the sort of things that, you can have all the transparency you want, but you need to put in regulations around how state actors, state media, state organs are allowed to have accounts, monetize those accounts. But you actually really want AI to be deployed. You want those labels in place so that, when the European Union decides to impose sanctions on RT and Sputnik, it can actually then identify those outlets on social media. So let's also think about, algorithms. AI can be used to identify quality news, to elevate the voices, for example, of independent Russian and Ukrainian outlets, independent outlets around the world. So to really see that this is a powerful tool that can be less of a hammer and more of a scalpel, but only with higher degrees of transparency, accountability, and trust. So I guess I would leave it at that.
Thanks a lot, Courtney. We only have 1 minute left, so I will ask the other speakers also for like a one sentence, maybe highlighting, just as not as elaborative and very useful as Courtney, just by kind of like, we should not demonize social media or AI, but at the same time also not pretend it's a silver bullet. So maybe this is kind of like the main message summarizing what Courtney just said. Our other speakers, could you also briefly, just in one sentence, say what would be your main recommendations or main sentence now at the end of this? Maybe starting with Eliška.
Yeah, I mean, it's always very difficult to summarize those recommendations in one sentence because I think there is a lot of work ahead of us. But I think self-regulation as much as state regulation are equally important. How actually these automated decisions or automated tools are being created, but also under what circumstances they're being used or legally mandated. So ultimately, we heard about a holistic approach. And I think we have to remember, especially if we want to tackle issues around content curation and business models and abuse of sensitive data or inferred data that we haven't really discussed today, but it's a significant issue which is very hard to tackle from the regulatory perspective. We actually need definitely good content governance law, but we also need a very good data protection laws in place, and definitely bits and pieces that actually complement each other, don't contradict each other, and ultimately enforcement. And enforcement is a very tricky issue. We see now, for instance, European Commission trying to remedy a potential lack of independence of certain national regulators, as well as being able to truly and fully enforce future laws, not only DSA, but also other regulatory efforts by taking more centralized role in that enforcement scheme. And that in itself can bring a lot of difficulties before we actually settle on the enforcement model that actually works and is effective in practice. And we all are fully aware of the mistakes that were done previously and how easily these regulators can be then subject to corporate or state capture. But no matter how perfect legal standards and what perfect recommendations we have on the paper, enforcement is definitely crucial. So I wish that we will achieve that regulatory landscape we are looking for and trying to build a step by step. But if anywhere holistic approach will work, it's precisely having those patchwork or those pieces within the patchwork complement each other.
Thanks a lot. So maybe next year we will be able to already have a conversation about the enforcement of the DSA and how well it worked in that sense. Esha, maybe you will also want to say one brief last final comment from your side.
Yes, thank you so much. And so much of it has been so wonderfully captured already. So I will be incredibly brief. And I mean, in times of when the issues that we have discussed today is high on the political agenda, and as civil society, we often hope that the political will to tackle the issues that we advocate for is as highly prioritized as it is right now. It's important to remember that in the pursuit of speed and efficiency, these two elements cannot facilitate the diminishing of state responsibility to uphold the rule of law or to protect our fundamental rights in the regulatory frameworks they develop in order to address these issues. And these must be completed in the spirit of democratic transparency and a multi-stakeholder approach, so that the developing solutions can be effectively implemented and enforced adequately to ensure everybody's rights online. But also, speaking lastly on that point of the multi-stakeholder approach, in order to attack those issues, this includes, as mentioned, the making sure that transparency and the increased transparency is effective and meaningful, and that the due diligence advancements by platforms is informed by increased research that is better needed to develop those solutions that we are discussing today. So thank you so much for inviting me to the conversation.
Thanks a lot. Matthias, anything to add?
Well, you are also so beautiful and great. So I really could just subscribe to what you've said. Perhaps and to add the one thing, there is also this AI Act coming from the European Union, so we need to watch out what it says in there. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks for reminding us about that. So with that, I think thanks so much to all of our speakers. Thanks to Concordia University and the Mix for having us. And thank you to the speakers, not only for their excellent contributions today, but also for their continued collaboration you have with the OSCE. And we really appreciate that. Thank you a lot. And we're looking forward to continue the conversation.
Thank you very much, Julia. And thank you to all speakers. To the audience, if you want, the AI forum is done for the day, but if you want to join tomorrow's sessions, the first one will be at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. It will be on artificial intelligence, homogenization policy, and the China Uyghur crisis. And then we will have a second one in the afternoon at 1 p.m. So you can check out the program and join us again tomorrow on YouTube. Thank you very much to the speakers, and thank you again, Julia, and to all our partners. Have an excellent day.